All right, well, we'll go ahead and finish up on Unit 2 there, and I put up the review for Unit 2, and so I'm going to, I actually finished our example for the crop project. Again, it's just a PowerPoint, and I'll put up a discussion board for them for you all to post your PowerPoints, and really the big deal is just to read those. There could be questions on the exam coming from that. The exam will be on Canvas, and I'll put it up, open it up first thing Monday morning, and you'll have to finish that Wednesday night, so we can get the grades in by Thursday morning. So anyway, let me know if you have any issues there, and try to get everything up today. The exam is just going to be based directly off of the quizzes. I'm not going to change the questions, considering we had that issue with the quizzes. So pretty much the same questions from the quizzes going directly to the exam. On that note, let's go ahead and finish up Unit 2, and just know that there is a review of Unit 2 PowerPoint that's just kind of condensing all that information into just one place. All right, so wanted to kind of go back to this whole quality thing, and we were talking about the consumer satisfaction depending on these hedonic values. And one thing I wanted to mention there is that it's really the consumer. I mean, we have entities that set the standards. USDA sets the standards for, what class it is, what the size needs to be to fit that class, what grade it is. But really, it's the consumer standard, the consumer's perception of what it's supposed to look like and taste like that determines how well we can sell a product. And these consumer standards, or at least the perceptions of the change in consumer standards, has been a huge issue, in terms of affecting really crop losses. So we look at the pest management. If there are any blemishes, the consumer, doesn't want to buy it. So that's caused grocery stores and marketers to, basically have a higher set of standards and causes more food waste. There's a lot, kind of a movement going on to push for these, what we call seconds, the stuff that doesn't fit in, grade A, to actually still sell that, the imperfect produce. It's still, perfectly fine. It just doesn't fit those high consumer and USDA standards. So I would look for those outlets. If as you're producing the crop, if you're not able to get to that grade A, then there still can be outlets for that. All right, so on the post-harvest treatments, we were just talking about how, one, we're going to try to cure some crops so that wounds will heal post-harvest. We have our low moisture content, our sugar content for some crops that we look at as indicators for when to harvest. And in your crop project, I'd like for you guys really to look at that and try to share what those indicators are for the harvest of your crop. So some other post-harvest treatments that have been used, irradiation, basically using UV light as a way to replace some of the chemical treatments. Still kind of burgeoning. I think it's becoming, safer and without damaging the produce and more widespread, but it still hasn't reached the point where it's a standard use, but it's out there. We look at some heat treatment, and really this is mostly used for processed. We don't use that for fresh market because that would damage the produce. One thing that we do for most of our vegetables and fruits to both make it shinier, improve the appearance of it, and also to reduce some water loss, is to use edible oils or waxes. And one thing that we always see this on is like apples. And, we can go from, a fresh apple being picked, stored in the right conditions, lasting several months, to now, lasting over a year with the application of these edible oils and waxes. It's something that's, I don't know, it's kind of weird. Like I prefer not to eat apples that are waxed. I mean, this makes the skin less appealing to me. But speaking of appealing, there's a new treatment that was just recently invented, and I'm just now starting to see produce in the stores that has been treated with it, and it's a company called Appeal, and basically they have created this cuticle-like covering that simulates the thick, waxy covering on leaves, and they're applying it to produce. So right now we're seeing that on avocados, which of course are notorious for like turning very quickly, and they're saying that they can get months out of ripe avocados instead of just a few days or weeks. So they're saying they can apply that to any kind of produce, whether it's soft fruit or fruit with a skin that you peel off. But I think we'll see stuff like that being adopted more as that science and technology improves. So if we look, kind of back in time, how do we, store crops before we had refrigeration? Often in more primitive communities, tribal situations, hunter-gatherers, crops were, and then in many cases, in some of these, civilizations are still out there, they still are storing these basically in pits, dug underground, maybe covered with leaves, or in some cases just in heaps on the ground. And in some cases we still use those even in modern society as well. So after we harvest it, do our post-harvest treatments, we got to store the crop somehow. So we look at grain. We're often storing these in large bins or silos. In this case, we've got a picture of grain elevators, and these are often kind of operated in the Midwest as kind of cooperatives. So, several farmers, work together to, kind of purchase this equipment, or in some cases, we've got the actual transporters, setting up these next to a train track, and we have these grain elevators. So farmers bring it to a central place in the community, and then they process it all and store it all together. The idea here is to have it airtight, so it remains that perfect moisture content, and insects, pests cannot get in and spoil it. We also look at cooling, and cooling we use just to slow that post-harvest respiration and kind of stall those metabolic processes in the crops, as well as slowing down the pests and pathogens that could affect them. So basically we're delaying deterioration through cooling, and we can kind of look at that as where the crop is coming from. So for the temperate crops, it's just above or just below freezing. For tropical crops, it's warmer. So, they typically are injured below 50 degrees. So different storage for different crops. Another thing that we have to look at, and this really we can look at pre-harvest as well as post-harvest, is the removing of field heat. Basically, as a crop is growing in the field, it's accumulating heat around the surfaces of the plant, and that's got to be removed so that it doesn't continue to build up and cause deterioration of the crop. So we can do that through cooling post-harvest, or we can do it pre-harvest even. In some cases, you might come through and just mist or spray the crops with cold water as a way to remove that field heat. We also look at the timing of harvest. So we can reduce that if we harvest them early in the morning when temperatures are naturally low before that, heat builds up. So it fluctuates on a daily basis as well as through the season. And you really kind of have to come up with your own way of dealing with field heat. In some cases, you might combine it with washing of the produce. So I think back to my time on the farm, we were growing this organic produce. Just two examples of that. We had in our hoop house, we were growing tomatoes and basil, and they were both kind of high value, kind of almost cash crop for our operation. So the thing that we found for the basil is if you wash it, it deteriorates it. If you harvest it, during the day, once that sun has come out, then it quickly will wilt. So we found that if we come into the hoop house before the sun has risen, we just pick the leaves, put them directly in the bag that we're going to sell them in, then that greatly reduces the field heat and the loss. And then once we have them in the bags, again, you got to harvest it all before the sun rises, because those bags will almost act like a little mini greenhouse, kind of cook them inside. So as soon as we have it harvested, we would put it directly in the refrigerator to bring it down to kind of mid 40s. And then it lasts for weeks. It took us, pretty much a full growing season to figure that out. Because when we, when we had the basil, bagged up and ready after we were washing it, we didn't know that it deteriorated. It looked good when we gave it to like the restaurants, for instance. But then we started getting complaints saying, all right, well, this stuff turns brown, pretty much within a couple of days. So we just started switching up our, post-harvest, pre-harvest treatments as a way to ensure customer satisfaction. Another example is of something like carrots, for instance. Carrots, they're underground, so they don't have as much field heat exposed to them. But what we first started out doing when we were harvesting our carrots is basically we'd have someone coming through and harvesting them and placing them in between the rows, big piles of carrots. Another person coming, grabbing those piles, washing them, getting the soil off of them, and then packaging them. But what we found is if the harvester was way ahead of the processor, then sun comes out, we get that field heat. It would cause carrots to begin to shrivel if we didn't immediately get water on them. So we just had to get it to where our harvester and our processor was working at the same speed, basically. Another example could be lettuce. As soon as you remove it from the plant, it doesn't have that, source of water to keep it turgid. So we almost immediately take that lettuce and hydrocool it or wash it. In some cases, some state agriculture and consumer services wouldn't allow you to say that it was washed. So you had to call it hydrocooling instead. So using some kind of marketing terminology along with that. Unfortunately, many crops cannot practically be harvested during the cool part of the day. So a lot of times we'll have mobile coolers to start cooling the crop as soon as it's harvested. So we look at that as hydrocooling, one of the easiest and most practical ways to remove that field heat, washing or hydrocooling. So we can do cleaning and cooling at the same time, and it becomes pretty practical on a small scale. Difficult to do on a large scale though. So on large scale, we generally have cooling rooms, and I'm not going to say that it's cheap, but it's become a lot cheaper to build your own cooling room if you have just the basic knowledge of refrigeration technology. So you can build a cooling room for just a few $1,000s, and it will save a lot of heartache really. So generally, we're going to take bulk items, we're going to place them in a refrigerated room to bring them down to temperature, keep them longer. We also have forced air cooling pictured here. So that's for delicate crops, things like leafy vegetables, berries, soft fruits, and some flowers. So they're basically put, in this case, on pallets right in front of this forced air cooler, pushing that air around it. It can also kind of avoid or limit the spread of pathogens since you're not doing it with water. It's really easy for those pathogens to travel in water. In some cases, we actually will cool produce by packing it in ice. Broccoli is a good example of that. You know, some crops will be injured. Broccoli, cauliflower, it's good to go. Cabbage. I mean, think about how you see it in the grocery store. If it's on ice in the grocery store, often the farmer getting it to the grocery store is also packing it in ice. Again, this can be expensive, but that might be the best way to keep it for the longest time. There's also vacuum cooling. Again, we're looking on a large scale here, where we basically seal crops in a large steel container, and then the pressure is rapidly reduced by a pump. So it works well, but again, it's very costly. So you don't see this, you usually see it more in like cooperatives and large scale farms than stuff on the smaller scale. They're basically using that vacuum cooling as a way to reduce the temperature by causing water to evaporate from its surface. So you have to be careful because that can cause leafy crops to wilt. So generally they will spray those crops with water to try to minimize that problem. So generally what we're looking at in terms of moisture, we want to avoid the loss of moisture because it will cause wilting and shriveling of a crop, which makes it unsellable. That can happen as, you know, a loss of even just 5% of the fresh weight. And remember that, you know, most of our fresh weight is in water. So you lose 5%, you get wilting, you get shriveling. Not good. So we can look at using humidifiers as a way to replenish that water or prevent that loss. But we have to watch out because too high of humidity can allow fungal spores to germinate and then can cause rotting. In some ways, we look at dehydration, as a way to preserve some crops that are not damaged when water is removed. And we can look at that through solar drying. And you know, we still use this today in a lot of crops. Onions, for instance, if you look at onion fields, they're drying and curing them actually in the field and basically in kind of spread out first to get them to dry and then put into piles before they're packaged. Complete dehydration, though, we don't usually look at solar drying for that. We usually look at other methods. But there are some examples of crops, like prunes, for instance, a variety that is actually dried, you know, on the plant. So if we're going to use solar drying, then we have to have a climate with high temperature around harvest time, clear days, and low humidity. So usually we see these taking place kind of in desert-like areas, arid zones. Our decay-causing organisms usually will not grow at moisture contents below 10 to 15%. So once it's dehydrated, it can pretty much last for, I mean, in some cases, years. We can also, in that reduction of weight and volume, reduce our handling and production and storage costs. Also, it's stored usually at, you know, in some cases, room temperature. So often does not require refrigeration either. So here's an example in grapes doing some solar dehydration. So they're basically putting tarps out to turn these things into raisins, basically. We also see that with apricots, currants, in some cases even peaches, figs, dates, pears, plums, and also sun-dried tomatoes too. Again, we usually only see this though in Mediterranean climates, places like the Central Valley of California, where we have that dry air and plenty of sunshine. Also, lack of moisture during the rainfall during the harvest season. So other ways to dehydrate, we look at forced hot air dehydration, where we're basically heating that air up to not to cooking temperature, but around between 140 and 160 or so, and circulating that air around the harvested product for a few hours to as much as 3 days, basically to get some dehydration. Some things that end up being processed, like dehydrated celery, carrots, peppers, that we put into process into like different ready-made meals. We can also do some dehydration by freeze drying, and this is through sublimation of ice. So basically we're going from ice directly to a gas, keeping it below the freezing point. So as it's melting, rather than going to the liquid state, it's going directly to a gas. That sublimation causes it also to dehydrate. So it's kind of a difficult thing to do without the aid of some sort of mechanical process. It's also expensive, but it can be valuable for high value crops where that weight reduction is necessary. So special markets, like for backpacking or for space travel, we have to freeze dry it because space and weight is an optimum. All right, so we also modify and control the atmosphere for storage for some crops to prevent additional deterioration. So in this case, they're exchanging nitrogen for oxygen in a sealed storage room. Crops only need about 1 to 2% oxygen to remain healthy, and anything at that oxygen level is going to prevent pathogens from being able to grow. Notice that they have these stacked with kind of foam-like dividers in between them, so they're not directly touching each other. So again, expensive, but can keep your produce going for a long time, which using these post-harvest treatments and these storage treatments, I think can be a way to kind of spread out your dollar throughout the season, rather than just having it just available just at harvest time. If you can have that product still be in optimal condition later on, you can sell it later, then that gives you the ability to potentially still make some money in the off season. We also use canning in some cases to destroy spoilage organisms by heat, and also in some cases to make almost like a prepared food. When we look at canning, again, we're usually looking at making a value-added product there. So we're adding value to it by canning, and we seal these in airtight containers that have been sterilized just by getting it just to that temperature that it needs to be. And usually we also look at high acid content as a way, depending on what we're doing. We either go with a pressure cooker if it doesn't have a high acid content, or we go to, like pickles, for instance, adding vinegar so that we get that high acid content that will prevent the growth of microorganisms that cause stuff to spoil. In some cases, like for making jams, jellies, and such, then we process that with high concentrations of sugar. And that sugar basically, it's sweetening it, right, making it a better value-added product, but it's also increasing the osmotic pressure to levels where water is unavailable for the microbe activity, which reduces spoilage. And again, good way to have a value-added product, but it requires an extra step. It requires more money and effort to be invested into it to store it for a long period of time. It can make sense, but you have to kind of analyze that. And I think the important thing is doing trial runs. You want to be sure that you can do that and still get a return on it. We used to have canneries in pretty much all the communities. We still have some. There's still a few that are left in neighboring counties here. But places where the community comes into a commercial certified kitchen, and that's one of the big things is the labeling part. If you're going to sell a certain amount, it has to be produced in a certified commercial kitchen that is inspected. If you're doing just small amounts, you can get away with it by labeling it not produced in a commercial kitchen. But I think VDAX right now, I think it's like $4,000. If you go above that in sales, then it has to be produced in a commercial kitchen. We also look at things processing with salt. So we do brine preserves, such as pickles, preserving beets. We also do fermentations, and that's really caught on in popularity in the past few years in probiotic food. So turning cabbage into sauerkraut, for instance, or kimchi. They will ferment anaerobically in a salt solution, which will prevent the spoilage and make it, available long term. And I think this is really a part where the food culture comes in. Somebody figured out that you could do this just from the growth of the not harmful bacteria, but the positive bacteria and fungi that produce, lactic acid, which lowers the pH and prevents the growth of organisms and changes the flavor of it as well, which some people really prefer. And again, are using a lot in that macrobiotic or probiotic diets because they have the probiotic. We're talking about these, beneficial microorganisms that are good for gut health. It's pretty fascinating. It's becoming really popular, so I'd encourage people to look into that. We talked about the growth hormone ethylene and how it accumulates from particular harvested crops, especially things like apples. They are off-gassing this ethylene naturally during the storage, handling, and distribution of the product. And it can be a bad thing or it can be a good thing. So it will promote the yellowing and abscission of leaves, distorted growth, the drop of petals on a flower, or cause things to continue to ripen. The thing here is that ethylene is coming from climacteric fruit, those that continue to ripen off the vine. It also comes from, decomposing plant matter, and also from internal combustion engines, ethylene is produced. So because of that, many produce storage facilities are using electric equipment. And again, we talk about removing ethylene and separating our climacteric from our non-climacteric fruits and other plant materials. But in some cases, we look at adding ethylene to induce ripening of like green tomatoes, for instance, to get them to turn red by the time they get to the store. And that's why they have a horrible cardboard-like texture, because they were picked green, right? Let's talk about marketing for a minute. Of course, hunters and gatherers, primitive agricultural societies had little or no marketing. They were mostly subsistence farmers. They're just growing and sharing the food with their own communities. But as we developed, a barter system and, the exchange of money, the variety of products available for exchange widened, and basically developed the need to market items. I think back to my grandparents, and they grew up in a very rural area of Tennessee and in Virginia, and they were basically subsistence farmers, but you couldn't grow it all. They couldn't produce it all themselves. So for things like flour or cornmeal, they would trade like dairy products, fresh milk for grains. So it started as the barter system, and in some cases we still practice some bartering. But then when we get to the money exchange, we look at basically saying, I've got this for X number of dollars. You got that for X number of dollars. Let's just trade the money rather than bartering of the crops there. So today, all of our producers are concentrating on growing the products that are best adapted to their particular area, soil and climate, the microclimate itself. And then they distribute regionally, nationally, and in some cases globally. And again, that's partially kind of that the consumer, idea there. When we are eating, soft fruits like plums in the middle of winter, they're coming from South America, where we have the opposite. They're having summer while we're having winter. So basically, we're growing our crops where they can best be grown and then transporting them. We look at a reversal of that trend as kind of the local movement. Locally grown produce can be an attractive marketing strategy. And I think a lot of people are buying into that in some cases, but it doesn't always make sense. If you're just going for local produce, then you have to recognize that there are limitations to what is available and when it is available. So all kinds of different marketing techniques kind of associated with that. The local food movement has really caused a resurgence in farmers markets, roadside and pick your own farms, as well as the community supported agriculture model, or the CSA. And the CSA kind of works as a subscription based model, something that we used to use as a way basically to get our overhead covered at the beginning of the season. So people subscribe to basically get a drop off point and get a box of produce, on a periodic basis, whether that's every week or every other week. It's a really good way to get, the money that you need for seed or fertilizer, early on. But the risky part of that is that you have to be able to provide items, a diversity of items to your customers throughout the season. And it was challenging, but it was fun to do. Who doesn't like a good challenge? What we found, though, is that at certain times, we might have a week where we didn't have very much to harvest, or we didn't have enough of a particular crop that we could harvest. So we would have to actually take some of that money, set some of that aside from our initial subscribers and go purchase produce from other farmers to be able to make it work. I know some other people that have just recently started a CSA, and kind of the same deal. In fact, they actually purchase the majority of the produce. In some cases, there are CSA models where they're purchasing all of it, and they're just kind of the broker, if you will. So it's an interesting way to get money in a different time of the season, and to get a lump sum rather than a little bit here and there. So good marketing strategy. And there's my bullet point about that. So again, here we're looking at the different marketing, whether it's wholesale or retail. The direct to consumer marketing can be great in that you have a handshake, a verbal commitment with your farmer, with your grower, directly with the consumer. That can be a good thing, but it can also take up a lot of time too, because you drop off produce, or at your CSA, people want to chat with you for a while, and that can be good, but as we all know, there's always something to do on the farm. So that can kind of be a downfall of that as well. In terms of direct marketing at like a farmer's market, one thing that I found is, we end up producing a lot of kind of unique products and crops as a way to kind of distinguish ourselves from other farmers, because the season's going to dictate that we can only grow certain things unless you're growing in a greenhouse So you try to be unique, and in doing so, you might have a brand new variety. I think I mentioned like the blue tomato to you guys. In some cases, you have to educate your consumer as to what it is. We have a crop called Jerusalem artichokes. It's a perennial sunflower that makes these little tubers that kind of taste like a water chestnut. They're really good, but people don't know what it is. And if they just look at it and they don't recognize it, they're not likely to buy it. So you have to be able to educate your consumer through your marketing strategies. And in some cases that might be, having a printout about the item, or maybe having recipe cards to hand out with them so they know how to use them. Marketing can be difficult, but you put all this effort into growing the produce, you got to be able to market it as well. So we look at the process of marketing, first being the assembly. That's getting a concentration of the small quantities of whatever commodity or product it is to a central place for handling and processing, whether that's on a small scale or on a large scale. And this basically, in some cases, the assembly part can give, say in a wholesale situation, give prospective buyers an opportunity to examine the products and arrange their purchase. We don't always have to look at assembly as being, a large volume step, though. We can kind of look at it as being done on a small scale as well. And we can also look at cooperatives as a way of doing assembly. So sharing with a community of farmers the equipment needed for processing, for instance, bring it to a central part. I've got a little bit of this, you got a little bit of this, let's combine so we can market it to a wholesaler, to a restaurant or something. So we look at this as, in some cases, assembly, catering to large food chains or grocery stores. In that case, you have a middleman involved, someone who is purchasing it. You're not getting it directly to the consumer. We then look at exchange, which happens in two phases, and that's one, first getting your buyers or sellers at the table, and then negotiating to an agreeable price. Often we have a middleman involved in that, a broker that does not necessarily take possession of the goods, but facilitates the transaction. And they usually represent producers of many products, and in some cases, many different buyers too. We kind of mentioned the grade standards there, and that's just another way of kind of getting that exchange and ensuring that it meets a quality standard without the buyer actually having to see it and inspect it. We then also look at financing, and that's essential in all of our marketing processes. So first, having the money to be able to produce, hold, and handle that product, that commodity, until it is sold and payment is received. So there's all kinds of different ways to look at the financing world, and I think Tom talks about that a fair amount in the more in the economics parts of it. So there's a lot of risk involved in the financing, and it is what causes this whole concept that less than 16 cents of every consumer dollar spent on food actually goes back to the farmer. So how do you improve that percentage, right? That's one of the things we need to look at. In some cases, we look at commodity markets and exchanges kind of as a way to get that assembled product onto a large market or exchange. This is usually what we're doing in large commodities, subsidized produce, or things that we might be exporting. So we look at that. Mostly foods that are going to be processed or non-food raw materials. We also look at some governmental marketing services. So whether it's just your county, or even in some cases community, state, or on the federal level, some governments participate in the regulation of the marketing. In some cases, they will set prices and regulate product production and distribution. For instance, the price of bread is actually regulated in Egypt, and milk is regulated in Denmark by the actual federal governments. The services that are provided by the government are intended for the protection of public health, especially, as well as the establishment of the standards and grades. So it's not, I mean, they're not trying to be major interveners, although sometimes it does seem that way. Trying really looking at safety and developing standards to where we're getting the highest quality for the best quantity, right? So mentioned the agricultural cooperative several times here, where producers are joining together, and generally where the farmers are owners, in many cases co-owners of this form of kind of marketing. So the members together provide the capital, have some sort of governance of it, and then they use their combined share of products and their combined capital to market those, as well as procuring supplies and obtain services. Generally, we don't look at those necessarily as profit-making businesses. They're kind of, it's one of these sort of cases where they're not nonprofits, but they're not like operating to make, you know, tons of extra money. Most of that money is reinvested back into the co-op. And it doesn't mean that you don't end up making money from it. It just means that that money is just reinvested back into the operation. We've also mentioned the direct marketing here, where we're selling directly to the customer. You know, you can get more money by doing this, but it's also more work. We're talking smaller volumes, and we look at, you know, having to advertise products through various ways. And the internet is becoming one, you know, big way of doing this. And we also mentioned how, you know, we have this interesting development in direct marketing for farmers as the concept of agritourism, where we're, you know, or some farmers call it agritainment, where we're basically providing an experience, an opportunity to experience the farm or the farm life, or maybe a product on the farm. We say now this is the fastest growing sector of agriculture in Virginia. More agritourism, they are, you know, forecasting that it's going to continue to grow and develop. We're actually part of some agritourism just the other day at our local vineyard, where they were basically, my band was playing music there while they were basically pressing the grapes and, you know, selling their wine. So you have some entertainment accompanying with the sales of the wine. So getting people to the farm. Also, again, the internet marketing. This has really developed a lot lately. And I think we're just kind of looking at the figures coming out from like Black Friday, for instance, and how the Cyber Monday is far exceeding, you know, what retail stores do these days. So the internet is a, you know, very important method of marketing your product. I think everybody should have, you know, some sort of place on the web, whether that's a website or, you know, a Facebook page or something like that through social media, as just as a way to get the word out. Some farmers have switched to doing that entirely. We were just reading an article the other day about a houseplant grower who only sells her stuff through Instagram. She puts a picture up and people comment on it saying they want to purchase it, and then it's done. It's a done deal. And she's, you know, grossing hundreds of thousands of dollars just by, in a small, you know, like 1 acre environment there in her backyard in Florida. So it can be done, you know. It takes some creativity though. So we look at these internet exchanges occurring at 3 levels. We got the business to business, the B2B exchange, where we sell or exchange the raw plant commodities through a marketing chain. That would be like, you know, selling through Amazon. Then we have the B2C, which is business to consumer roles, where we're doing direct sales, but that involves you having to, you know, send it out yourself, which can be kind of another step. It adds a level of difficulty and another headache in there. We also look at having to supply aiding information just to search for the buyers and sellers. So that's basically, we're using the internet as a way to broker. But without having a third party, we're just doing the brokering by providing that information. As these technologies develop, there are more platforms. We're going to have new marketing applications evolving along with that. So going back to the storage part of marketing, it's necessary at various stages in that marketing sequence. The producer's producing the product and then either storing it themselves for sale or getting it to a buyer to operate storage facilities and control the supply and time of the resale. We also look at the processing plants that operate storage facilities to hold the raw product stocks and the processed product until it is distributed. And on that note, that finishes Unit 2. Anybody have any questions or concerns there? All right, well, you guys get on there, finish up the quizzes. You know, basically everything will have to be in by Wednesday, next Wednesday. So we got a week to wrap everything up to get your grades in. So just keep in contact. Let me know if you have any issues with that. Check on the Canvas side. I'll have the example for your crop project up here in just a few minutes.